On the dawn of September 5, 1902, the citizens of Oakhaven, Wyoming, were roused by a sight so inconceivable it would shadow their town for generations. In the stately residence of the Blackwood family, 8 beds lay perfectly undisturbed, their linen smoothed with an almost fanatical neatness, just as they had been left the evening prior. Yet the chambers felt as hollow as neglected crypts. The 8 sons of esteemed industrialist Alastair Blackwood, William, 27, Thomas, 25, twins Benjamin and Samuel, 23, Daniel, 21, Matthew, 18, and David, a mere 15, had evaporated into the early morning air, without leaving a single impression in the dew that silvered their windowsills. No panes bore marks of intrusion. No entrances had been left unsecured, and most unnerving of all, their nightshirts hung precisely on their appointed hooks beside their beds, as if the brothers had simply dematerialized into the chill of the approaching autumn. The local marshal's report, suppressed by a federal mandate for over 7 decades, contained one blood-freezing particular that officials declined to discuss with anyone, including the boy's own father. Each sleeping quarters displayed proof of having been meticulously combed through by someone deeply acquainted with the home's floor plan. Yet not a single item was gone. Not pocket watches, not personal effects, not even the modest sums the older brothers kept in their desk drawers. The fate of the 8 sons of Oakhaven endures as one of the nation's most eerie and insoluble mysteries. And the reality concealed within those age-stained government dossiers unveils a web of avarice, depravity, and forced servitude that extended much further than anyone in that remote Wyoming settlement dared to suspect. Before we proceed with the saga of the Blackwood brothers and reveal the startling proof that has been intentionally concealed from view for more than a century, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you never miss these somber historical puzzles that expose the concealed realities of America's heritage. Also, tell us in the comments which region you're listening from. We cherish hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts across the globe, and your interaction aids us in resurrecting these lost narratives. The inquiry that followed would uncover not merely the destiny of 8 blameless young men, but a whole system of predators that had been methodically tearing apart households across the American frontier for generations. The fall breeze that swept down from the Wind River Range and through the lanes of Oakhaven carried with it the blended aromas of pine smoke, turning leaves, and the persistent sharp scent of copper ore that had turned this overlooked pocket of Wyoming territory into one of the most flourishing towns between Cheyenne and Salt Lake City. In 1902, Oakhaven was a community suspended between 2 realities, the rugged frontier outpost it had been just a dozen years before and the civilized society it yearned to become as capital and influence traveled westward along the freshly finished Union Pacific Railroad spur. With a populace that had grown to nearly 900 souls, Oakhaven embodied all that Americans in the early 20th century believed about potential, advancement, and the boundless prospects of Western settlement. The central thoroughfare hummed with life from first light until long after dark. Freight wagons laden with copper or rumbling toward the railway terminal. Well-attired financiers alighting from the night train from St. Louis and Boston. And households that had journeyed thousands of miles for the opportunity to forge new existences in a place where a person's value was judged by his grit rather than his ancestry. Yet below this surface of affluence and modernity festered the very same strains that troubled settlements all over the American West. The swift influx of capital and newcomers had forged sharp divides between the founding families who had endured the difficult early days and the recent arrivals who came with Eastern money and polished commercial affiliations. Labor grievances simmered perpetually between the miners who hazarded their lives daily in the copper pits and the absentee owners who resided in comfort hundreds of miles away. Most alarming of all were the hushed worries about young men who had come with their kin only to then mysteriously depart for prospects in far-off cities, leaving behind only ambiguous explanations and sorrowful goodbyes. At the heart of Oakhaven's metamorphosis stood Alastair Blackwood, a man whose astonishing ascent had become lore throughout the territory, but was starting to draw uneasy scrutiny from those who questioned how a simple hardware merchant had amassed such remarkable riches in so brief a time. Alastair had reached Oakhaven during the fierce winter of 1893, guiding a solitary wagon loaded with fundamental provisions and accompanied by his 8 sons, his wife having succumbed to scarlet fever during their trek from Pennsylvania. The vision of this resolute widower and his children clustered around a campfire in the biting cold had stirred the town's founders to extend aid, and Alastair had rapidly established himself as both an astute merchant and a dedicated parent. Within 3 years, Alastair's humble hardware store had grown to become the biggest commercial enterprise between Casper and Jackson. He had brokered exclusive agreements with mining concerns, established trade partnerships with suppliers in St. Louis and Denver, and somehow obtained the funding required to erect the most impressive private dwelling in 4 counties. The 3-story Queen and Mansion on Cedar Avenue with its intricate spindlework, leaded glass windows, and sweeping veranda served as both an emblem of his achievement and a testimony to his dedication to furnishing his sons with every advantage that wealth could procure. The 8 Blackwood brothers had matured into young men who were esteemed and admired throughout the community, each cultivating unique characters and aptitudes that enriched Oakhaven's civic and social fabric. William, the eldest, possessed a keen mind and innate leadership qualities that had made him the most capable foreman the town's mining operations had ever known. His innovative management techniques, which stressed safety and fair treatment over brute output, had drawn acclaim from workers and owners alike from as far as Laramie. He was known for working extra hours to assist struggling crews, organizing training for inexperienced miners, and advocating relentlessly for better equipment and hazard pay. Thomas, just 2 years Williams Jr., had inherited their mother's musical gift and had cultivated it into a passion that enhanced the entire town. His compositions, stirring orchestral pieces that captured the majestic grandeur of Wyoming's peaks and valleys, hymns that lifted spirits in the town chapel, and lively dance tunes that brought joy to community gatherings, were performed at events all over Oakhaven. He had arranged cultural evenings that brought refinement and amusement to the frontier town, including concerts, musical recitals, and poetry readings that attracted visitors from adjacent settlements. The twins, Benjamin and Samuel, were inseparable comrades who had directed their natural aptitude with wood and metal into a prosperous carpentry and blacksmithing shop that employed several local men and provided services ranging from simple repairs to elaborate architectural elements. Their workshop had become a meeting place where men could deliberate community matters, exchange news, and support one another through the trials of frontier existence. Despite their matching looks, the twins had forged distinct identities. Benjamin was the more gregarious and commerce-focused, while Samuel possessed a quiet depth that made him a trusted confidant for many of Oakhaven's inhabitants. Daniel, 21 years old and blessed with a commanding presence and a gift for oration, had become the cornerstone of Oakhaven's civic and benevolent endeavors. He organized town meetings, directed holiday festivals that attracted crowds from across the basin, and spearheaded relief drives for households impacted by mining disasters or other misfortunes. His empathy and administrative talents had made him essential to the community's work to care for its most at-risk members, including widows, orphans, and injured laborers. Matthew, at 18, had already exhibited a mechanical genius that astonished his mentors and made him invaluable to his father's increasingly intricate commercial undertakings. He could diagnose and repair any mining machinery, design more efficient ore processing systems in his sketchbook, and identify flaws in mechanical designs that eluded experienced engineers. His father had started consulting him on significant business choices, and several prominent industrialists had commented that Matthew possessed the most brilliant engineering intellect they had ever witnessed in someone so youthful. David, the youngest at 15, brought vitality and optimism to all around him, with a spirited character that could enliven even the most dismal winter day. Despite his age, he had already shown notable maturity by volunteering at the town's fledgling hospital, where he read to convalescing miners and assisted the nursing staff with basic tasks. His innate compassion and sincere concern for others had made him adored by families throughout Oakhaven, and many forecast he would mature into a doctor or community leader, who would carry on his family's tradition of service to the town. The Blackwood family's prominence in Oakhaven society, however, had started to attract attention that Alastair found increasingly disquieting. Some townsfolk murmured that his swift wealth accumulation hinted at ties to powerful interests back east, while others queried how a man who had appeared with practically nothing had secured the financing necessary to build such a lavish residence and grow his enterprise so spectacularly. These suspicions intensified during the summer and early autumn of 1902 as Alastair commenced hosting private discussions with well-dressed strangers who arrived on the night train and departed before sunrise, conducting their affairs in muted conversations behind the sealed doors of his library. The political and economic atmosphere of 1902 added another stratum of strain to life in Oakhaven and across the American West. The nation was still mending from the crippling economic panic that had started in 1896, and the consequences of bank collapses, business shutdowns, and joblessness continued to reverberate through communities that had previously known steady prosperity. Labor conflicts were growing more frequent and violent in mining towns throughout Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah as workers unionized to demand improved pay, safer conditions, and protection from the arbitrary authority of distant proprietors who viewed frontier laborers as disposable assets. The recently established Western Miners Alliance had been actively organizing workers across Wyoming, and several mines in nearby towns had endured strikes that occasionally turned bloody when mine operators imported armed guards or appealed to territorial authorities for militia intervention. Local businessmen, including Alastair Blackwood, found themselves trapped between the legitimate grievances of their workers and the demands of Eastern investors who cared little for the welfare of frontier towns and insisted on maximum profits irrespective of human toll. This unstable environment was further convoluted by the swift changes that railroad expansion had delivered to previously secluded communities. The Union Pacific's extension to Oakhaven in 1898 had brought unprecedented wealth, but it had also revealed the town to external influences and criminal syndicates that preyed upon frontier families. Reports circulated of swindlers, land speculators, and assorted criminal ventures that followed the railroad lines westward, seeking chances to exploit the isolation and limited legal resources of frontier outposts. The events of September 4, 1902, commenced with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made residents of Oakhaven thankful for their choice to build lives in Wyoming's breathtaking scenery. The cottonwood trees that bordered the town's primary avenues had reached their peak autumn hues, creating a tapestry of gold and amber that dappled the morning light into patterns of exceptional beauty. Alastair Blackwood unlatched his hardware store at 7 o'clock precisely, as was his unvarying habit, while his sons pursued their established daily patterns with the comfortable predictability that had defined their family life for years. William walked to the mine office at 8 o'clock, his leather briefcase filled with the shift plans he had drafted the night before. Foremen gathering at the mine entrance observed that he seemed more preoccupied than normal, answering their greetings with courteous but distracted acknowledgments rather than his usual engaged discussion of their operational concerns. Several veterans later remembered that William's typically impeccable appearance seemed slightly rumpled, as if he had dressed hurriedly or without his normal meticulousness. Thomas set up his music stand in the sunroom of the family home where he had been composing for several weeks a symphony that captured the autumn transformation of the Wind River Range. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who resided next door and often watched Thomas work from her parlor window, noted that the young composer seemed incapable of concentrating on his score, frequently setting down his pen to pace around the room or gaze toward the train depot at the town's outskirts. Most unusually, Thomas appeared to be writing and erasing the same few measures repeatedly, as if his creativity had deserted him. The twins, Benjamin and Samuel, opened their workshop at 9 o'clock and immediately began laboring on the elaborate staircase they were crafting for the new bank building. However, their typical cheerful banter was supplanted by intense, hushed discussions that ceased abruptly whenever patrons entered the shop. Mr. Robert Higgins, who brought in a broken harness for repairs, later testified that the twins seemed anxious and distracted, making uncharacteristic errors in their craftsmanship and having to restart their work multiple times. Daniel spent the morning at the town hall preparing remarks for the upcoming Harvest Festival. But Deputy Mayor Silas Crone noticed that his normally confident delivery seemed hesitant, and he repeatedly paused mid-sentence to stare out the windows toward the main avenue. When he asked if something was amiss, Daniel's reply was vague and uncharacteristic. He claimed to be feeling slightly indisposed, but refused his offer to summon Dr. Abernathy or to send word to his father. Matthew worked in the hardware store alongside his father, but several customers remarked that he seemed uncommonly quiet and made basic mechanical calculations incorrectly, which was utterly unlike his normally faultless engineering acumen. Alistair himself appeared tense and preoccupied, frequently consulting his pocket watch and peering toward the street as if anticipating someone or something that failed to appear on time. Even young David, normally the most spirited and talkative of the brothers, seemed withdrawn as he assisted Mrs. Dobbs with the household's daily chores and preparation for the evening meal. The housekeeper later recalled that David asked several peculiar questions about travel, whether she had ever been far from Wyoming, whether she missed her family when she had worked in other towns, and whether she believed it was possible to be content when separated from everyone you loved. As the afternoon advanced, the subtle disruptions that had marked the brothers' conduct throughout the day grew more pronounced. At approximately 3 o'clock, Dr. James Abernathy was returning from a house call when he came upon all 8 brothers walking together along Pine Street in the direction of the railway terminal. This struck him as highly irregular since their daily routines usually kept them occupied with their individual duties during the afternoon hours, and he had never seen them all together away from the family home except during civic functions or special community gatherings. What unsettled Dr. Abernathy most profoundly was the brothers' demeanor as they walked. Normally robust, conversational, and engaged with everyone they met, the 8 young men moved in total silence, their faces ashen, and their countenances troubled in ways that indicated profound emotional distress. They walked with the mechanical precision of individuals who were compelling themselves to fulfill an unpleasant but inescapable duty, their usual assurance and natural confidence replaced by a stiff resolve that seemed almost martial in its severity. When Dr. Abernathy called out a hearty greeting, only David glanced back, and the dread in his youthful eyes chilled him to the core. The boy's face, normally alive with energy and inquisitiveness, bore a look of terror that seemed wholly incompatible with the secure, familiar environs of their hometown. For an instant, their eyes met across the distance, and Dr. Abernathy later swore that David's gaze conveyed a desperate appeal for assistance, that he was powerless to voice aloud. The last confirmed sighting of the Blackwood brothers as a group came from Arthur Lowell, the night operator at the telegraph office, whose window provided a clear view of the main street and the wooden boardwalks where the town's residents conducted their evening business. At approximately 9:15, Lowell glanced up from his work transcribing messages to observe all 8 brothers standing together beneath the orange glow of the gas lamp directly outside his office window. Their formation and body language struck Lowell as extraordinary and disquieting. Rather than the casual grouping of brothers engaged in conversation or family matters, they stood in a perfect row facing toward the train station. Their posture was rigid and their attention focused with an intensity that implied both expectation and apprehension. They appeared to be waiting for something or someone specific, their stillness so absolute that Lowell initially wondered if his eyes were deceiving him in the flickering lamplight. What rendered this sighting especially significant was the unusual nature of their attire. Instead of the practical work clothes or comfortable evening where they typically selected for family time, all 8 brothers were dressed in their finest suits, formal were more appropriate for significant occasions or ceremonial social functions than for an ordinary Thursday evening in Oakhaven. Their hair was combed with a formality that suggested meticulous grooming, and each wore accessories that Lowell had only seen them display during religious services or community commemorations. Most alarming of all was the collective expression visible on their faces in the lamplight. Rather than the anticipation or pleasure that might accompany preparations for a special event, the brothers displayed a mixture of resignation and fear that suggested they were bracing themselves for an ordeal, rather than looking forward to a celebration. When Lowell looked up from his work again roughly 10 minutes later, they had vanished as silently and mysteriously as they had appeared. The hours that followed remain among the most baffling facets of the entire enigma, largely because the only witness to events within the Blackwood household was Alastair himself, whose account of the evening would later prove to contain major inconsistencies and omissions. According to his initial declaration to Marshal Cooper, Alastair retired to his library at approximately 10 o'clock to examine business correspondence that had arrived on the afternoon train. He claimed to have spent about 90 minutes reading letters and updating his commercial ledgers, a practice that had been his immutable custom for years. Mrs. Dobbs, the family's housekeeper and the only non-family member with regular access to the household, completed her evening tasks and left for her own cottage at precisely 10 o'clock, as was her established routine. Her later testimony provided critical details about the atmosphere within the house during those final hours. She described an unusual hush that seemed to permeate the entire structure. None of the brothers' voices could be heard from their rooms. No footfalls echoed from the upper levels, and even the normal sounds of settling timber and shifting furniture that characterized the large house in the evening seemed subdued and strange. Most significantly, Mrs. Dobbs noticed that the usual preparations for the following day had not been finished. Typically, the brothers would lay out their work clothes for the morning, gather tools for their various trades, and complete small household chores that would make the next day's routines more efficient. On the evening of September 4th, however, none of these preparations had been made, as if the brothers had abandoned their normal concern for future activities and concentrated entirely on immediate, undisclosed worries. Alastair claimed that he went to bed at his usual hour of 11:30, assuming that his sons had already retired to their respective chambers on the second and third floors of the house. His account of his evening routine matched the pattern he had followed for years: a final inspection of the doors and windows, a brief prayer in the family's small study, and retirement to the master bedroom that he had occupied alone since his wife's death during their journey to Wyoming. What transpired during the hours between 11:30 on the evening of September 4th and dawn on September 5th remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire case. Alastair maintained that he slept soundly and heard nothing unusual during the night. Yet the physical evidence discovered the following morning suggested that extraordinary and carefully coordinated activities had taken place throughout the house while he remained oblivious in his bedroom. The discovery that would transform the Blackwood disappearance from a family catastrophe into a nationwide mystery began at dawn on September 5th when Mrs. Dobbs arrived to commence her daily routine of preparing breakfast and organizing the household for another day. Her key turned smoothly in the front door, which she found securely bolted as she had left it the previous evening, and she entered the house expecting to encounter the familiar sounds and rhythms of a large family beginning their morning activities. Instead, she was greeted by a silence so deep and unnatural that she later described it as feeling like stepping into a sepulchre. No footsteps resonated from the upper floors. No voices called morning salutations, and even the mechanical sounds of the house, the ticking of clocks, the settling of wooden beams, the whisper of air moving through the rooms, seemed muffled and alien. Mrs. Dobbs's first instinct was to attribute this unusual quiet to the family having overslept, perhaps due to late-night activities or the effects of the unseasonably cool weather that had settled over Oakhaven during the night. Her concern began to escalate when she discovered that the kitchen showed no indications of having been used for the late evening meal that was part of the family's established custom. The brothers typically prepared coffee and simple fare around 10 o'clock each evening, gathering in the kitchen to debate the day's events and arrange plans for the following day. On the morning of September 5th, however, the kitchen remained exactly as Mrs. Dobbs had left it the previous evening, clean, orderly, and completely unused. Growing more bewildered and concerned, Mrs. Dobbs ascended the main staircase to the second floor where William, Thomas, and the twins maintained their bedrooms. The hallway was eerily quiet with none of the doors standing ajar, as was typical when the brothers were readying for their morning pursuits. When Mrs. Dobbs knocked softly on William's door and received no answer, she hesitantly turned the handle and discovered a sight that would haunt her for the remainder of her days. William's bedroom appeared exactly as it would have looked if he had never retired for the evening. The bed remained made with the same scrupulous attention to detail that characterized William's approach to all facets of his life. Corners tucked with geometric precision, pillows arranged symmetrically, and the coverlet stretched without a single crease. His nightshirt hung on its customary peg near the wardrobe, precisely where he had placed it before dressing for supper the previous evening. His hairbrush and comb sat in their usual positions on the dresser alongside the small stack of ledgers he had been reviewing and the shift plans he had prepared for the following day's work. Yet, despite this appearance of perfect order, something felt profoundly amiss about the room. Mrs. Dobbs, who had cleaned and organized this space countless times over the years, immediately sensed that subtle alterations had occurred. The items on William's dresser, while arranged neatly, were not positioned with the exact precision that William invariably maintained. Several ledgers had been removed from their shelves and replaced in incorrect order, and the papers in William's desk showed signs of having been examined and res-tacked by someone unfamiliar with his filing system. The discovery in Thomas's room was equally disturbing and puzzling. Like William's, the bed showed no indications of having been slept in, and Thomas's musical materials, sheet music, pens, and manuscript paper, were arranged with a neatness that was utterly uncharacteristic of his normally disordered creative space. Thomas typically left his room in a state of organized chaos that reflected his artistic temperament, with half-finished compositions propped on every surface and musical instruments leaning against the walls. On the morning of September 5th, however, everything had been cleaned and organized with an almost obsessive attention to detail that was entirely foreign to Thomas's personality. The twins' shared bedroom presented the most disturbing evidence of whatever had transpired during the night. Benjamin and Samuel had always maintained their space with identical precision, their possessions arranged in perfect symmetry that mirrored their close bond and shared habits. On the morning of the disappearance, however, their room showed clear indications of having been systematically searched by someone who had attempted to restore order but lacked intimate knowledge of the twins' exact organizational methods. Tool chests had been opened and closed, their contents inspected and replaced, but not in the precise arrangements that the twins invariably preserved. Mrs. Dobbs's horror reached its zenith when she climbed to the third floor and discovered that Daniel's, Matthew's, and David's rooms told the same impossible story. 3 more beds that had never been slept in. 3 more sets of nightshirts hanging undisturbed, and 3 more chambers that showed subtle but undeniable proof of having been carefully searched by someone acquainted with the house, but not intimately familiar with each brother's personal habits and preferences. Her screams, when they finally came, echoed through the morning calm with an intensity that brought neighbors running from blocks away. Mrs. Dobbs fled from the house in a state of near delirium, stumbling through the streets of Oakhaven and crying that the boys were gone, that something dreadful had happened, that the impossible had somehow occurred in their secure and familiar community. Alistair Blackwood, awakened by the commotion and the sound of voices gathering outside his home, initially refused to believe what Mrs. Dobbs was telling him. He rushed through the house, calling his sons names and inspecting each room with a desperate hope that some simple explanation would resolve the crisis. Instead, he was confronted with the same impossible evidence that had terrified Mrs. Dobbs: 8 bedrooms that showed no signs of having been occupied during the night, yet clear signs that someone had methodically examined every personal effect, every document, and every possession that the brothers had accumulated during their years in Oakhaven. Marshal John Cooper arrived within minutes of being summoned, but nothing in his 15 years of law enforcement experience in frontier communities had prepared him for the methodical investigation that the Blackwood disappearance would demand. Cooper was accustomed to dealing with straightforward crimes: livestock theft, claim jumping, occasional violence stemming from personal quarrels or excessive drinking. The systematic vanishing of 8 young men from a secured house without any evidence of forced entry or indications of a struggle presented challenges that surpassed both his expertise and his resources. Cooper's initial examination of the house corroborated Mrs. Dobbs's observations while revealing additional details that deepened the mystery rather than providing clarifications. Every door and window in the house remained securely fastened from the inside with no evidence of tampering or forced entry. The front and back doors showed no signs of having been opened during the night, and the windows were all latched in their normal positions. Most puzzling of all, there were no footprints in the soft soil around the house's foundation, despite the fact that anyone entering or leaving the building during the night would necessarily have left distinct tracks in the damp earth. The systematic search of the brothers' belongings became more apparent as Cooper conducted a detailed inspection of each room. In every instance, personal items had been examined and replaced, but not with the precision that would indicate familiarity with each brother's habits. Clothing had been unfolded and refolded. Personal valuables had been inspected and returned to cases, and private papers had been read and res-tacked. Yet nothing appeared to be missing. Expensive watches remained in plain sight. Modest amounts of cash were undisturbed in desk drawers, and even sentimental objects that would be meaningful only to the brothers themselves remained exactly where they had always been kept. Marshal Cooper's investigation expanded systematically throughout Oakhaven, as he interviewed every resident who might have observed pertinent details during the evening of September 4th or the early morning hours of September 5th. What emerged from these conversations was a pattern of strange happenings and subtle disturbances that had been building throughout the summer and early autumn of 1902, creating an air of unease that many residents had noticed, but few had been able to articulate clearly. Multiple witnesses reported seeing well-dressed strangers arriving on evening trains during the weeks preceding the disappearance. These visitors, always impeccably attired in expensive Eastern suits and carrying fine leather cases, would conduct brief meetings with prominent citizens and then depart on the following morning's train without engaging in any of the normal social activities that characterized business visits to frontier communities. Their presence was noted not only because of their obvious wealth and sophistication, but also because of their deliberate avoidance of the kind of casual interaction that was customary in small towns where strangers were typically welcomed and included in social activities. The telegraph office confirmed an unusual volume of encrypted messages being dispatched to addresses in St. Louis, Boston, and Denver during the same period. Arthur Lowell, the night operator who had witnessed the brothers' final public appearance, revealed that these messages were typically sent late in the evening and consisted of seemingly random combinations of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him, but obviously conveyed specific information to their intended recipients. Most of these messages were sent by Alastair Blackwood himself, though several other prominent citizens had also dispatched coded communications to the same Eastern addresses. The town's bank president, Frederick Sterling, initially proved reluctant to discuss his institution's recent transactions, but Marshal Cooper's persistent questioning eventually revealed financial irregularities that cast Alastair Blackwood's rapid success in an increasingly troubling light. During the 6 months preceding the disappearance, Alastair had made several large withdrawals of gold coin totaling sums that represented a significant portion of his accumulated wealth. These withdrawals were unusual not only for their size, but also for their timing. They had occurred immediately following the visits of the mysterious Eastern strangers, suggesting a direct link between these encounters and Alastair's financial activities. More disturbing still were the bank's records of Alastair's deposits and investments, which showed a pattern of wealth accumulation that seemed inconsistent with the profits that could reasonably be expected from operating a hardware store in a frontier community. Even accounting for the prosperity that the copper mines had brought to Oakhaven, Alastair's financial success appeared to far exceed what should have been possible through legitimate commercial endeavors. Sterling's records indicated that Alastair had received regular payments from Eastern sources that had no apparent connection to his retail business, and these payments had increased substantially during the months leading up to his son's disappearance. As autumn stretched into winter, the case attracted attention from federal investigators and newspaper reporters from across the country. The story of the 8 missing brothers captivated the American public with its combination of mystery, tragedy, and hints of corruption that seemed to epitomize the darker aspects of frontier life. Newspapers from Boston to San Francisco published detailed accounts of the disappearance, often accompanied by artists' renderings of the brothers and speculative theories about what might have befallen them. The federal investigation led by Inspector Franklin Pierce from the Department of Justice brought resources and expertise that were far beyond what local authorities could provide. Pierce had extensive experience investigating criminal syndicates that operated across state and territorial boundaries, and his involvement in the Blackwood case reflected the federal government's growing concern about organized criminal enterprises in frontier communities. His investigation would eventually uncover evidence of corruption and criminality that extended far beyond the borders of Wyoming and involved some of the most prominent business and political figures in the American West. Inspector Pierce's examination of Alastair Blackwood's business records revealed financial irregularities that suggested connections to a sophisticated criminal organization. Alastair's rapid accumulation of wealth coincided precisely with a series of questionable transactions involving mining claims, railroad contracts, and territorial government appointments. Most disturbing were his documented connections to a secretive investment group known as the High Plains Development Consortium, which had been acquiring mineral rights throughout Wyoming and other western territories using methods that local authorities were powerless to investigate or regulate. The High Plains Development Consortium proved to be a particularly elusive target for federal investigators. The organization operated through a complex network of subsidiary firms, shell corporations, and proxy agents that made it virtually impossible to identify its true owners or determine the source of its apparently unlimited financial resources. What Pierce could establish was that the consortium had been systematically acquiring control of valuable natural resources throughout the West, often through arrangements that involved local officials and prominent citizens who received substantial payments in exchange for their cooperation. Alastair Blackwood's relationship with this organization appeared to have begun shortly after his arrival in Oakhaven when he received what his records described as investment capital that enabled him to expand his business far beyond what would have been possible through normal commercial profits. In exchange for this financial support, Alastair had apparently provided the organization with detailed information about local mining operations, land ownership patterns, and political developments that could affect business prospects in the region. As winter settled over Oakhaven and the immediate search for the 8 brothers gradually shifted from active investigation to cold case status, the town itself began to undergo changes that reflected the trauma and suspicion that the disappearance had generated. Several families, uncomfortable with the implications of the federal investigation and the attention that the case had brought to their community, decided to seek opportunities elsewhere. New residents arrived who had no connection to the tragedy and no investment in uncovering the truth about what had happened to the Blackwood brothers. Alastair himself became an increasingly reclusive figure who rarely left his empty mansion except to visit the cemetery where he had erected 8 granite headstones despite the absence of bodies to inter beneath them. His hardware store, once the center of commercial and social activity in Oakhaven, was sold to new owners who had no knowledge of or interest in the mysterious circumstances that had led to Alastair's withdrawal from community life. The new proprietors found that many of Alastair's business records had been destroyed or removed, making it impossible to understand the full extent of his financial relationships or the source of his former prosperity. The physical evidence of the brothers' former presence gradually disappeared from Oakhaven as well. Their clothing and personal effects were packed away in the mansion's attic. Their artistic and civic contributions to community life were replaced by new activities organized by recent arrivals, and even their names began to fade from daily conversation as residents focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on a mystery that seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. By the spring of 1904, many of Oakhaven's original residents had departed for opportunities in other communities, taking with them their memories, suspicions, and theories about what had really happened to the 8 brothers. The town that emerged from this transition bore little resemblance to the close-knit community that had existed before September 5, 1902. In its place was a more impersonal settlement populated largely by people who had no emotional investment in the Blackwood tragedy and no interest in pursuing investigations that might threaten their own opportunities for prosperity and advancement. The transformation of Oakhaven from a community united by shared history and mutual support into a collection of strangers focused primarily on individual advancement reflected broader changes that were occurring throughout the American West. As the 20th century began, the frontier's promise of limitless opportunity and democratic equality was increasingly challenged by the reality of organized exploitation, systematic corruption, and the growing power of Eastern financial interests that viewed Western communities as sources of natural resources rather than as collections of human beings deserving protection and respect. 24 years after the disappearance that had shattered the Blackwood family and transformed the community of Oakhaven, a discovery in St. Louis would reopen the case and reveal connections that stretched far beyond the borders of Wyoming. In the spring of 1926, during the demolition of an abandoned factory on the city's industrial waterfront, construction workers uncovered a concealed vault that had been hidden behind false brickwork and forgotten for decades. The chamber contained dozens of filing cabinets, storage crates, and personal items that told the story of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among the artifacts discovered in this hidden archive were 8 small photographs, each showing one of the Blackwood brothers in formal poses that suggested professional studio work. The images were accompanied by detailed written descriptions of each brother's character, skills, family history, and physical attributes compiled with the kind of thoroughness that suggested commercial rather than personal interest. Most disturbing of all, the photographs appeared to have been taken after the brothers' disappearance from Oakhaven, as several showed the young men at ages they had never reached in their Wyoming home. William appeared to be in his late 40s in the photograph, his face showing the maturity and weariness that came with adult burdens and experiences. Thomas's image captured him in formal attire that suggested affluence and social standing, but his eyes held a sorrow that seemed incompatible with material success. The twins, Benjamin and Samuel, had been photographed separately rather than together, their identical features showing subtle differences that suggested they had developed distinct personalities during their years of separation from each other and their family. Daniel's photograph showed him in professional dress that suggested he had maintained his involvement in civic or philanthropic activities, but the expression on his face conveyed a profound dejection that spoke of aspirations deferred and ambitions abandoned. Matthew, captured in what appeared to be his late 20s, wore the clothing of a man engaged in technical work, but his once bright eyes seemed dimmed by experiences that had crushed his natural inventiveness and mechanical curiosity. Most heartbreaking of all was David's image, which showed him as a young man in his early 20s, handsome and properly dressed, but with none of the spirited energy and optimism that had made him cherished in Oakhaven. Detective Michael O'Malley of the St. Louis Police Department, who had been investigating the factory discovery as part of a broader inquiry into organized crime activities, immediately recognized the significance of these photographs and the accompanying documentation. The materials were part of a vast archive that detailed the operations of what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal organization specializing in what they euphemistically referred to as labor placement services and social advancement opportunities for frontier families. The organization's records, maintained with meticulous attention to detail over several decades, revealed a business model that was both ingenious and horrifying in its systematic exploitation of vulnerable families throughout the American West. The criminals had identified communities and families whose isolation, economic struggles, or social circumstances made them susceptible to offers that promised better lives for their children, particularly their sons. They operated through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses, employment agencies, apprenticeship services, educational institutions, and charitable organizations, that provided perfect cover for their actual activities. Detective O'Malley's investigation revealed that the organization had been operating under various names and through multiple front companies since at least 1888, systematically targeting families in frontier communities where law enforcement was limited and communication with outside authorities was difficult or impossible. Their methods involved careful research into local conditions, identification of families who might be vulnerable to financial pressure or social manipulation, and the deployment of sophisticated confidence schemes designed to convince parents that they were providing their sons with opportunities for advancement and prosperity. The process typically began with the arrival of well-dressed strangers who presented themselves as representatives of Eastern corporations, technical schools, or professional organizations seeking to recruit young men for positions that promised significant financial rewards and social advancement. These recruiters carried impressive credentials, letters of recommendation from prominent figures, and detailed proposals that seemed to offer genuine opportunities for families struggling with the limitations and hardships of frontier life. Parents who expressed interest in these opportunities were gradually drawn into increasingly complex arrangements that involved financial investments, legal contracts, and promises of future benefits that seemed too good to refuse. The organization's representatives were skilled at exploiting parental anxieties about their children's futures, particularly in communities where economic prospects were limited and social mobility seemed increasingly difficult to achieve. The organization's records discovered in the St. Louis factory provided chilling details about how the scheme operated and how families like the Blackwoods became targets. The criminals maintained extensive files on communities throughout the West, documenting economic conditions, political developments, and social dynamics that might create opportunities for their operations. They employed local informants who provided detailed information about families, their financial circumstances, their relationships with neighbors, and any vulnerabilities that might make them susceptible to manipulation. The Blackwood family had apparently been identified as an ideal target for several reasons. Alastair's rapid accumulation of wealth had made him the subject of local suspicion and jealousy, creating a social environment in which his family might be more willing to consider opportunities that promised to remove his sons from the growing tensions in Oakhaven. The brothers' diverse skills and talents made them particularly valuable to an organization that needed capable young men to staff its various enterprises throughout the country. Most importantly, Alastair's financial relationship with the High Plains Development Consortium had given the organization leverage that could be used to pressure him into cooperating with their plans for his sons. The documents discovered in St. Louis included detailed records of the organization's communications with Alastair Blackwood during the months preceding his son's disappearance. These records revealed a systematic campaign of pressure and manipulation designed to convince Alastair that his business success, his social standing, and even his personal safety depended on his willingness to cooperate with the organization's plans for his sons. The organization's representatives had skillfully exploited Alastair's fears about his financial situation, his concerns about his son's futures in a community that was becoming increasingly hostile to his success, and his anxieties about the potential consequences of his business relationships with the High Plains Development Consortium. The final communications, dated just days before the disappearance, made it clear that Alastair had been given an ultimatum: either cooperate with the organization's plans to provide his sons with employment opportunities in the East, or face financial ruin, social disgrace, and potential legal consequences for his business activities. The most disturbing revelation contained in the St. Louis archive was the organization's method for removing young men from their communities and families without attracting unwanted attention or provoking official investigations. The process involved careful planning, precise timing, and the cooperation of local officials who had been compromised through financial incentives or other forms of pressure. The organization maintained a network of safe houses, transportation routes, and employment facilities that enabled them to move young men across state lines quickly and efficiently, often using false identities and forged documents to avoid detection. Once removed from their communities, the young men were typically transported to locations where their skills could be exploited for the organization's benefit. The more talented and capable individuals were often placed in positions that generated significant profits for the organization, while those with fewer marketable skills were typically assigned to manual labor or other forms of exploitation. The organization maintained detailed records of each individual's placement, performance, and eventual disposition, creating a chilling database of human capital that was managed with the same efficiency and attention to detail that characterized legitimate business operations. The discovery of the St. Louis archive and the subsequent investigation by Detective O'Malley and federal authorities provided the first concrete evidence of what had happened to the Blackwood brothers and hundreds of other young men who had disappeared from frontier communities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The organization's records indicated that the brothers had been transported to various locations throughout the country, where their skills and talents were exploited for the benefit of the criminal enterprise that had arranged their removal from Oakhaven. Williams' managerial abilities had apparently been put to use supervising labor crews in mining operations controlled by the organization. Thomas's musical talents had been exploited in entertainment venues that served as fronts for other criminal activities. The twins' mechanical skills had been utilized in manufacturing facilities that produced goods for the organization's various business interests. Daniel's administrative abilities had been employed in managing the organization's extensive record-keeping and financial operations. Matthew's engineering genius had been directed toward improving the efficiency of the organization's industrial enterprises. Even young David's compassionate nature had been exploited in ways that served the organization's interests, though the specific details of his assignment were not clearly documented in the records discovered in St. Louis. The federal investigation that followed the St. Louis discovery eventually led to the identification and prosecution of several individuals connected to the criminal organization responsible for the Blackwood disappearances and similar crimes throughout the West. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the organization's operations and the sophisticated methods it had used to exploit vulnerable families in frontier communities. Testimony from former members of the organization provided chilling details about how young men were systematically identified, recruited, and transported to locations where they could be exploited for financial gain. The prosecutions resulted in prison sentences for several prominent figures who had been involved in the organization's activities, but many of those responsible had died before the investigation was completed, and the full extent of their crimes would never be known. For the residents of Oakhaven who had lived through the trauma of the Blackwood disappearance and its aftermath, the revelations from St. Louis provided a measure of closure, but also deepened the tragedy by revealing the systematic nature of the exploitation that had destroyed their community. The knowledge that the brothers had been victims of a sophisticated criminal enterprise rather than random misfortune did little to ease the pain of their loss or repair the social fabric that had been torn apart by suspicion and fear. The town that had once been a close-knit community bound by shared values and mutual support had been permanently transformed by the events of September 1902. In its place was a settlement where trust was more difficult to establish, where newcomers were viewed with suspicion rather than welcomed with open arms, and where the memory of the 8 brothers served as a constant reminder of the vulnerability that came with isolation and limited resources. The story of the Blackwood brothers and their mysterious disappearance from Oakhaven endures as one of the most haunting mysteries in the history of the American West. Their fate, like that of so many other young men who vanished from frontier communities during this period, reflects the darker aspects of a historical narrative that has typically been portrayed in terms of opportunity, progress, and democratic expansion. The systematic exploitation of vulnerable families, the corruption of local officials, and the sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated with impunity throughout the West represent a chapter in American history that has received far less attention than the more celebratory accounts of frontier life that dominate popular understanding. The disappearance of the 8 brothers from their secure home in Oakhaven stands as a poignant symbol of the human cost of this hidden history, a reminder that the promise of the American frontier was always accompanied by risks and vulnerabilities that have been largely forgotten in the nostalgic retelling of the nation's westward expansion. The empty beds that greeted Mrs. Dobbs on the morning of September 5, 1902, represent not merely a family tragedy, but a historical reality that continues to challenge our understanding of America's past and the complex forces that shaped the development of the western United States.